Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Kevin O'Neill. For the last year, I've had the pleasure of representing Swift in the Canadian market, and I'm very pleased to be here with a very esteemed panel. And if the number of times they were stopped and chatted with on the way just to get to this room is any indication, you're absolutely in for a treat. Rule 101 of any moderator is come up with an expert panel and check the box for sure, because I think it'll be a very interesting discussion. So I'd like to welcome Lisa, Stephanie, and Cyrus, and I'll let them introduce themselves as we go from left to right.
Hi, I'm Lisa Ford. I'm RBC's payments lawyer, and I'm responsible for supporting the bank's arrangements for payment processing globally, including our arrangements with networks like Swift, as well as exploring the development and use of new technologies like DLT for payments.
I'm Stephanie Z. I'm with Citibank. I am the cyber risk head for the global payments business. I'm based out of New York. It's an in-business risk management role that focuses on identification and implementation of risk mitigation strategies related to cyber breaches, both on us, on customer, on vendor, as well as cyber fraud.
And my name is Cyrus Bhathawalla. I'm a managing director in KPMG US's payments and banking practice. So I help lead both our North American and our global payments transformation programs. As you can tell from the accent, I'm not from Canada or the US, and I spent about 7 or 8 years doing similar work for our firm across Southeast Asia and Hong Kong.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a lot of acronyms at Swift. If you're familiar with Swift, that's probably an understatement. We have a lot of sayings. And one of the things we talk about is global payments today. There are a lot of challenges, but the primary challenge is not necessarily a technology challenge. The technology may be the easy part. The primary challenge is a regulatory, a compliance challenge. If you're a bank today, you have to pay anybody anywhere in the world, and you can only pay through people that you know. And the risk of not doing that from a cyber perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from a fines or money going out the door perspective, can be quite high. So how do you manage that? And so as we were talking amongst our panel, we decided kind of the 3 takeaways that we'd like you to walk away with is what are those existing and emerging developments? Many of you are probably aware of them. What are the challenges that these developments and risks are causing in the industry today? And what are the right tools and frameworks to put in place to kind of mitigate those risks and manage those frameworks? So when I was growing up, my mom had a saying, it was all well and good until somebody gets hurt. And I was the big brother in the relationship, and she was primarily referring to the fact that there may have been some exuberant, interactive, physical activities between my little brother and I. So my little brother is now 6'4", and I look at this situation and getting hurt in a whole different framework and a whole different light. And certainly I think we can all adjust to the challenges that we face as an industry and as we move forward. So Swift paid for the room. So, and as a sponsor, you get to put up with me for a few minutes. And what I hope to do is to set the stage. Then I'll ask my panel some questions, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions. All right, so with that, we kind of move on. So many of you are probably familiar with all of these different drivers of change and all these different factors, right? These are all things that you need to balance. And there's not enough time in the day to balance all of them, but how do you balance the new technology? When do you invest, right? Operational cost, operational risk. How do you continually reduce cost as we go to what if, right? Instant, invisible, free types of payments. The payment is just on the back of a customer experience. But you still need to have the right operational framework, and you still need to be able to drive down costs. What are all the different data privacy and geopolitical aspects that you need to deal with as you manage global payments? As an example, we're launching a pre-validation service where you can go out and you can look at, okay, the account number exists. Does the beneficiary name match the account number? Well, guess what? In different jurisdictions, you don't do that. That's only in some jurisdictions. Every different jurisdiction might have its own policies and procedures, either before the transaction is executed or during transaction execution time. So how do you balance all of those? And of course, regulatory pressure only gets easier every day, right? And cyber risk continues. Group one and very sophisticated actors continue to put pressure. So it's the battle of the fraudsters and the criminals against the payments geeks. And so here's hoping that the payment geeks win. A couple more quick slides and just a few stats to kind of set the stage. So another story, just to kind of, this past fall, I had to move money into my son's bank account. Domestic US dollar transfer to GPI banks. Should be pretty easy, right? He, of course, left it to the last minute, so we actually had to get it there same day. Money went out of the bank at 8:30. At 4 o'clock, it still wasn't in the receiving bank. Luckily, the receiving bank had a branch not too far from my office, so I walked into the branch and I said, guess what, folks? I wired some money this morning and it's still not in my son's account. Not even the person waiting on me in the line, somebody walking behind that person in the branch looked at me and said, wires can take a few days. I said, no, they don't. They take a few seconds. Your back office reconciliation process may take a little bit longer. Immediately introduced to the branch manager, escorted to the back of the branch, who checked, and sure enough, my money was in my son's account. And he wrote me a nice letter, which I then FedEx for $50 out to Chicago for the next day so my son could get his Italian visa. But today, we still have this perception problem, right? The fastest GPI transaction cross-border screened and credited to the beneficiaries in 8 seconds. The fastest three-party transaction was 27 seconds. 3 banks, 27 seconds, cross-border screened. More than 50% settle within 30 minutes and more than 40% in 5 minutes. Now that we can track things, why do things slow down? Foreign exchange controls, documentation controls, time zone differences, back office reconciliation, and the dreaded other, which you can't tell your client about, which tends to be regulatory and compliance. So now that we can track things, we can see where things are going, and we can start to address these problems and make things go faster. But you also have to be secure, right? So we've had a lot of success in the customer security program, 99% by value. But what does that really mean when you start digging under the covers? What jurisdictions are 100%? Where do you see risk? How do you put the right framework in place where you don't have bias against one country versus another, but you still need to address those risks, all right? Another challenge that we all must face, and as we rush to ISO, right, we look across all of our kind of payment universe, and 90% of payments, this is a simple MT-103, we did some work last fall, 90% of those payments had some form of unstructured, free format, or blank fields, right? I was talking to a payments product manager. He said, I'm happy to have that fee compression conversation, but give me clean payments. 90% unstructured, and there's always, when we walk into the compliance side of a bank versus the operation side of the bank, it's kind of a different conversation each time, right? 90% of unstructured are not clean payments. And as we move to things like ISO, and we start validating information on the network, we start adding more structured information, this is a challenge that we as an industry are going to have to face, like a project within a project. It's more than just the syntax. Last couple of plugs and scary numbers and things is around, even if you look at those 103s and you look at the different roles that are out there, so we have a product called payment controls. Payment controls can stop transactions based on a pattern and 2 years of history, right? But it depends on the role that you play. Are you an initiating bank? Are you the Benny bank? Are you an intermediary bank? And if you look at all those different combinations of fields, right, there's over 1,300 different permutations of data that you have to go through. The only way you can do that is through machine learning, artificial intelligence, and having the right tools. But you also need to have a human attached to that so that you can interpret those results, and each bank will have its own risk tolerance. The last scary stat, and I'll use my name as an example, 4 billion combinations, fuzzy logic combinations. If you look at across all the lists, look at all the different permutations of names, there's over 4 billion different combinations. So my name is Kevin O'Neill. Officially, it has the apostrophe. Officially, I'm a 1L O'Neill. According to the 2L O'Neills, you never want to be ill on the end, by the way. According to the 2L O'Neills, my family is a bunch of horse thieves. So am I on a sanctions list? Am I on a sanctions list with 2 L's? Am I on a sanctions list with an apostrophe? When I check into a hotel and they can't find my reservation because it has an apostrophe in the name and it's 1:30 in the morning, that's a big deal, right? When you have to deal with 4 billion different conversations potentially, and you're in 200 markets, also kind of a big deal, right? So you have to have smart technology to deal with all of these things. So we have some frameworks. I won't spend time on them around cyber, around compliance, right? You can get them on our website. We consult with the industry. We're happy to have conversations as, kind of the bank cooperative as well as 2,000 corporates. We're happy to have those conversations. But what I think is probably more important now is for me to get to the Rockstar panel and ask them a few questions. So we'll go left to right. And we'll start with kind of the opening statements. And the opening statements are kind of the summary of all, and then we'll kind of come back to them throughout the panel. There's a lot of different actors in this space: fintechs, banks, corporates, vendors, right? Everyone, cyber criminals, fraudsters, they're all highly invested in global payments, right? When we talk about commercial payments, because there's probably a distinction between commercial frameworks and retail frameworks, right? We're talking about commercial payments, wholesale global payments. What are the tools needed to balance speed versus risk? You have to be fast, but you have to be secure, and you have to be compliant. What emerging developments and risks do you see? We'll start with Lisa.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a big question. I am going to try to be brief in my remarks, but I am the lawyer on the panel, and I do get paid by the minute. So sit back, relax. In seriousness, I think the best defense is a good offense. Since we have less time to assess transactions as they're in progress, we have to have increasingly robust measures in place on the front end to prevent problems before they occur. That's intrinsically good, but it's also an important factor in determining liability when issues arise. It's a threshold question in legal disputes as to whether each party has met their standard of care, met their obligations in the first place. So, step one, in my view, is always prevention. And that's closely coupled with protection. And thirdly, you have to be prepared to mitigate liability if something goes wrong. And each of those 3 prongs is really multifaceted. For example, when it comes to prevention, you have your onboarding requirements and your security tools. Onboarding requirements for clients and counterparties are table stakes. It's essential to have well-defined parameters concerning who you're prepared to deal with, and those are based on increasingly stringent AML and ATF laws. And regulators are reinforcing these requirements by imposing substantial fines for noncompliance. According to Finergo research in 2018, there was roughly $26 billion in fines imposed on FIs globally for noncompliance with these laws over the last decade. And of course, a system is only as good as its weakest link. So a factor to consider when looking at your counterparties is how well equipped are they to manage these onboarding requirements? How proactive are regulators in the jurisdictions where they operate to enforce those rules? Because ultimately, if everyone's doing what they should be doing upfront, the risk of someone accessing the system who shouldn't is going to correspondingly diminish. Equally important is ensuring you are using the right security tools to prevent unauthorized activity. Each party must have in place the most robust and up-to-date security tools that are available to it. And this is where SWIFT's customer security program has really been pivotal in mandating a minimum baseline of security capability to ensure the best-in-class protection of the SWIFT network when it comes to fraud and cyber. And at RBC, we've doubled our investment in those areas over the last 4 years. And all of this is necessary because we're facing new challenges in today's world. In particular, there are multiple parties now involved more than ever in financial transactions, whether they're the fintechs, the new payment service providers in the ecosystem, or banks. There's a broader surface area that we need to protect, and we need more innovative tools to do this, like AI and machine learning, which will make it faster and easier for us to detect vulnerabilities and anomalies in customer behavior. And this is where protection comes in. Customers have a very important role to play when it comes to protection. They have to be well informed of the existing threats they're facing and how they can do their part to protect themselves. And education and awareness on this point are really key. And FIs have a key role to play in that education and awareness piece. A recent poll at RBC, we found more than 75% of Canadians felt that they were knowledgeable when it came to cybersecurity, but only 16% could correctly identify cyber terms like phishing. On our part, we need to understand customer behavior to protect them. To do this, it's imperative that we establish a baseline of what is normal customer behavior in order to then identify what's unusual. And one of the challenges we're facing in this area is the increasing layering involved in payments transactions. Payments are increasingly embedded within the customer experience and go through multiple parties and sometimes multiple systems, even before they hit the financial system to be completed. And this layering that we're seeing in payments transactions is introducing new risks for the parties involved, because it's obscuring information that would be helpful to financial institutions to develop a reliable baseline and track behaviors. To overcome this challenge, I think this is where I see increasing collaboration with fintechs, with the new payment service providers in the ecosystem. We all need to work together in order to put all of the pieces of the puzzle together. Which brings me to my last prong, which is preparedness. Being prepared is an essential part of your payments arsenal, and it's really helpful to plan in advance for unexpected situations. It's helpful to know who's responsible for doing what information you can share and with who, and how are you going to make it right for the parties that are affected. And my role as legal counsel in this respect is negotiating really clear contractual terms with our counterparties to delineate where the responsibility of one party begins and ends, so each party clearly understands what they're responsible and accountable for doing, and also what they're going to be held liable for when something goes wrong. So with that said, I think I just recap. It's the 3 Ps from a legal perspective. You have prevention, protection, and preparedness. So I'd be interested to hear from my colleagues. I'll turn it to you, Stephanie.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. So I agree with everything that Lisa said, and I'm just going to take it down, peel back the onion perhaps a little bit too. With regards to what tools to balance speed and risk, you have your baseline protect, so that's on your network, intrusion detection, monitoring, and all those other kinds of great things. From a payments perspective, I would suggest you look at tools available in industry or self-made, your institution proprietary build across the payment transaction life cycle from end to end. And so building on some of the things that Lisa had said, from that you need to work with your clients and whoever's initiating those transactions to ensure that they're doing all of the things that they need to do to ensure that that transaction is valid, that the creator, maker, checker, all of those other aspects of the payment is accurate before it comes to the bank. From a bank perspective, you've heard a lot of, and there are a lot of other sessions related to AI in anomalous payment detection. Those are all tools that are tools that are used in not only in the detection, protection, or identification monitoring in the network application space, but also now in the payment. Is that payment norm or not norm? And the challenge with some of those tools now is what's the right data in order to create the scoring models to determine whether it is or it isn't, but also the fact that the bad actors are also deconstructing what it is you're doing. So if they know that your threshold's at $1 million, they're going to make that payment $950. So there's a constant evolution of how to integrate other tools, biometrics, biometric behavior, identification, access, et cetera, in addition to and complementing AI or machine learning in those aspects of it. I think, from a Canadian perspective, you are at a very opportune time as it relates to the deployment and use of these kinds of tools. You are going through industry modernization with regards to the rails. You're going through your institutional modernization. So you have the ability now to think about a security by design in your transformation process. A lot of the challenges with financial institutions, big and small right now, that some of these tools that are available today are having to be bolt-on. You go through the payment process, you have to take it out of the payment stream, you have to run it through the AI, et cetera, et cetera. In Canada right now, because you've essentially got a blank sheet of paper, and I know it's not as simple as that, but you can think about security by design and enable these elements so that you can still facilitate the element of speed without compromising the client experience component of that. And I think that's really important for this particular market. With regards to emerging developments and risks, there's a number of things, and I've got a whole list, but I won't go through them all. But I think, the developments and the risks are I think about it in two different buckets, if you will. One is on the bad actor side, they are also and have moved to real-time transaction, fraudulent transactions. So yes, they may have been in your networks for months doing reconnaissance and research and understanding, but when they choose and pick their time to execute, they execute. And they execute quickly, and they put hundreds of transactions into the market. And so you don't have a lot of time to react. And building off what Kevin had said, you've got about 30 minutes for 50% of those GPI transactions. 30 minutes is not a lot of time to determine whether or not that transaction is or isn't fraudulent, and whether or not you do or don't pull that back. And you've got, depending upon where that payment, where that beneficiary account is, an hour, 2 hours before it hits that account, and as VocaLink showed this morning, subsequently disperse, and you're not going to see that money back. So the question around tools is, you've got GPI, you've got Tracker, you've got Stop and Recall now, and you need to be able to ensure that those kinds of tools are enabled so that you can implement not only systemic industry speed bumps, such as some of those tools, but also within your own applications and platforms, you need to have some speed bumps. And yes, the speed bumps need to vary. You need to manage the client experience. But I can tell you that for those largest organizations that have experienced WannaCry, NotPetya, they will tell you, I will take some friction in payments for transactions, pick your number, $1 million and up, $5 million up, $10 million and up. There is a tolerance there depending upon what the risk appetite is, and the, as they say when you go to a casino, only take what you can lose. Same sort of thought here. If you're not going to put in those speed bumps, then you need to be comfortable with what it is that you can lose. Some of the other, developing risks specifically targeted. The financial industry, no question, is a target. It's where the money is, as they say, right? And what we've seen with some of the specifically targeted industries or institutions is you need to also understand how you're interwoven with your parties, your counterparties, your vendors, your suppliers, because some of the challenges that organizations have come were because they were collateral damage. They weren't necessarily the specified single target, but because we're a networked community in so many different ways, very easily you can become collateral damage. And you need to understand the processes of whether or not you were the target or you were collateral damage outside of that. And then the last one I'll just talk about is that the bad actors are never just attack once. It's a persistent threat. And when an institution, corporate, FI, or otherwise, has been breached, from those of us in the payments focus, you need to recognize that if your system is down, it's not behaving properly, you need to go and check to see whether or not the payments that you just executed in the last hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, are actually true, appropriate, and not fraudulent. Because in many cases, the cyber attack is a guise for the ability to create cyber fraud. So with that, I'm going to pass that to...
No, I like that a lot, Stephanie. Actually, no, one of your comments, and I'm going to steal and pilfer shamelessly, is security by design. And
I wrote that one down. I was going to steal it too.
It's the ultimate form of flattery.
thought
Just believe it. It sounds better with the accent, but beyond that, it's the same. There you go. But so if we talk about faster payments and real-time payments as an example of those, in and of themselves, they're not really an unsecure or insecure payment mechanism, right? What it does is it gives fraudsters a greater opportunity to exploit the real-time funds availability nature of the payment. The reality is actually the AFP released a report about 3 months ago that actually identified the majority of fraud, between 20 and 33%, was still occurring on ACH credit and debit transactions in the US. So they were not targeting newer fintech-style payment mechanisms of Venmo or even Zelle. At that point had relatively low transactional volume, but still was not being exposed as being something the fraudsters were targeting. That being said, with the introduction of faster payment types, there are probably 3 key areas that we advise our clients to focus on because of what we've seen in other jurisdictions. So number one is what I call protecting the front door. It's much easier to prevent a fraudulent transaction than to detect one. So what does that involve? That involves learning from the UK's faster payments experience, which I'm sure the majority of folks in the room know, which was to create better both KYC and account authentication and integrity controls, preventing the opportunity for a fraudulent transaction to have ever occurred in the first place. This has now evolved 10 or 12 years later to not only being a technology discussion. The UK's new payments architecture program is heavily looking at not just technology, but also protecting consumers, both corporate and consumer customers, from giving away credentials, not in a negligent fashion, but in phishing attacks like you were talking about before, Lisa. We are seeing technology attacks be a little bit less prevalent in these newer environments, and instead social engineering being a significant factor. So the UK just reported in the first half of 2018, they experienced £145 million worth of social engineering detected or categorised fraudulent transactions across their entire payments ecosystem, not just in the faster payment space. So they are heavily focused on, okay, technology is at a certain point where it can get to preventing these issues. We now need to actually tackle the consumer, which is an education challenge in many cases. Australia has experienced a similar thing when it comes to the NPP launch. Very proud to say that they actually haven't experienced an increase in fraud across all of their payments environments after the introduction of NPP. And they're running a system which has no centralised transaction limit. Each bank gets to decide that. So the highest value transaction to date, I think, was $17 million. I assume if Chris Hamilton, the ex-CEO of APCA, is in the room, that was his bonus payment for hitting the budget date. No, I guess he's not in the room. That's a shame. But actually, the first fraud transaction that was identified was actually an 80-year-old man transacting $4,000 at 4 o'clock in the morning. And because the banks so heavily invested on their own internal infrastructure, some of them were doing full rip and replace, so $20 to $40 million expenditures by one of the top 4 banks. That kind of transaction has been identified in line with processing. There are, however, other financial institutions that either don't have the budget or the need to invest quite that heavily, and that's when we start to talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence. So where can you use these new components alongside and in complement with your legacy infrastructure, I think very much like what you were saying, Stephanie, to actually make those legacy infrastructures work more effectively, but also faster. Now, the challenge that the banks that we saw doing this, both good and bad, was actually all linked to data quality. And we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail, but it's a little bit of a garbage in, garbage out kind of conversation. If you don't have the right quality of data, transactional data, standardized and normalized data, and in some cases at an industry level, if that's what the capability calls for, This hybrid model where you get to avoid very large rip and replace investments is not really going to work. And that high quality data is generally driven from, and I hate to say it, a strong data strategy, which seems very nebulous, but actually we can talk about what those components involve, and a strong enterprise governance model for that data. Without those two components, you really can't leverage. You can have a fancy toy, as one of the ex-CEOs of a bank in Australia told us. You could have a gold-plated solution, but unless you know how to use your new toy, it's not worth the paper it's printed on.
Thank you to all the panelists. So 3 Ps, security by design. You need to look at things from an end-to-end transaction perspective, because if you secure one part, the fraudsters just kind of move upstream, right? And it's all about the data. What's the right data? And one thing I'll note as well, and Cyrus referenced, ACH fraud and things like that. So while the customer security program is a SWIFT program, it's a good hygiene. It is good practice, and it is applicable to all payment processes. Right? It doesn't have to be just your SWIFT environment. We strongly encourage it, clearly, and we've had great progress in the industry. But any type of payment should probably be looking at that type of framework. Right? So we've heard a few folks talk about the data. You heard Cyrus talk about garbage in, garbage out. And that term's been around for a really long time. So what are the information sources? How do you manage multiple information sources? How do you know what you can trust, right? And how do you separate what's real and what you really need versus kind of noise in the system? And Stephanie, we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. So I'm going to break that into 2 pieces. Information related to intelligence around what do you believe in, what do you not believe in, and there are a multitude of forums out there. And you have to pick and choose what it is, and you need a construct in your organization, a governance construct, to ingest that information and figure out and determine whether or not it's relevant and actionable for your organization. Some of it is precautionary, some of it is maybe specific that you need to do something, but that also ties back to what's your organization's risk tolerance and risk appetite for some of these things too. So it all needs to tie back with regards to the overall organization. And remember that even though that some of these intelligence organizations and sources are, stood up by government or industry, et cetera, that doesn't mean that the bad guys haven't joined too. So it's know your sources and it's trust but verify. On the other, sort of definition of information, I guess related to this question in my mind is, as Cyrus had spoken about, which is the data that you use to drive actions, to drive decisions, to build your AI models or machine learning models. It is about the cleanliness and hygiene of that data in and out. But the next piece is that information, what data points are relevant? What are you going to use the information to drive an action or an outcome for will determine what pieces of data you're going to input into it. And part of the art of machine learning, particularly in outlier detection tools, et cetera, is what's the right payment data goes in. Does every transaction go in? Do you put on us transactions in that algorithm? Do you put funding payments to the Fed or chips in that, or do you take that out? And each one of those decisions of whether or not that data point should be in or out, you have to also recognize you're creating bias in the data set to which you are then building an algorithm on. So you need to be really clear on what it is you're trying to get to, understand what the different elements of data are and how it could create bias within your data set or within the outcome. Because the worst thing you want to do is, to your point, you're chasing something over here, so you built something over here, but it's actually, it's the dull, bland thing sitting in the background is really what you're trying to solve for. And that's the art part of the art and science related to any use of AI and machine learning, et cetera, and the use of that data. So you need to have not just good data hygiene, good data governance. When you're going to deploy it into those tools, you need to know why you're using that data and how it could create that bias.
So thanks, Stephanie. So you need a governance construct, You need to trust but verify your information sources, right? You need to know what question you're trying to ask and what information sources you're putting into those when you start to put into your machine learning and artificial intelligence, which kind of takes me to our third question, and we'll start with Cyrus in terms of what are you seeing across your client base and in the industry in terms of, big data, machine learning, what technologies are being invested in? Are there frameworks for return on investment? So could you comment a little bit about what you see?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of best practices, some of the things that we're seeing that are leading the charge in terms of effectiveness, and effectiveness can be measured in two ways. Both is your reduced financial crime outlay, so your expenditure, but then there's also the efficiency of that capability, right? So if you have an extremely low financial crime or fraudulent transaction outlay, that's great. But if your false positive rate and your customer experience is extremely poor as a result of that, it's not really a happy or symbiotic relationship, unfortunately. So the things that we're seeing that have been very successful is data aggregation and consolidation across the enterprise, then domestically and then globally. So what does that mean? So within an institution, it's very common to have silos of data to the point where you may not even know in one data set for one transaction who the beneficiary and the originator of a transaction are. So having both clean and normalized and standardized, you can use all of those terms about data integrity, having clean and standardized data that can be aggregated within an enterprise is really critical to being able to actually leverage a lot of these machine learning or artificial intelligence components. You can then expand that concept to beyond just your own enterprise. You then start to talk about domestically. So let's talk about the clearinghouse's infrastructure for real-time payments. Even NPP infrastructure in Australia has this capability that has not yet been activated that effectively allows for pattern matching of fraudulent transactions. But again, if you don't have clean data, if you don't have high quality data, it's not going to be sufficiently effective to identify those transactions. And then if you talk about aggregation at a global level, this is where you probably see folks like Visa and MasterCard having the strongest capabilities today, SWIFT certainly as well. And this is where you're starting to get aggregation of transactional data at a global level that is able to be passed out and used in a confidential fashion by financial institutions and corporates. Then the question is, well, is transactional data sufficient? Is that really all the data we need to be looking at? And if it's not, how do we go about acquiring that other data? So I think folks would be fairly familiar with the fact that you can augment your existing customer data with that of industry bodies, like Early Warning Services does in the US. You can also buy additional data, but you don't need to buy it only from your individual industry. You can be buying it from folks like Amazon, Google, even Netflix sells their anonymized data in certain scenarios. That is often in partnership. Sometimes it's actually being sold. So examples of that are NASDAQ just bought a company called Quandl very recently. Experian, Equifax, even KPMG has something called a signals repository, which is it's effectively data services. So I'll use what I find quite unique use case. So Quandl was bought by NASDAQ about 6 months ago, and one of the use cases they talked about was non-financial transaction data related to seasons, as in weather patterns. And when you have a security that has extremely high volatility or high volumes of transaction at a particular point in time, that is where they are often most exposed to fraudulent transactions of that particular company, stock, industry, whatever the case may be, depending on who's targeting you, who the fraudster is. So they actually identified a way to use the seasonality patterns that Quandl holds, which have nothing to do with financial transaction data, to predict the points in time and the individual fraudsters who would actually be attacking specific securities. And so that was fascinating to me from the point of view of you're using a completely external data set that has nothing to do with that individual stock or bond or security, and you're actually able to predict and identify where you need to protect the front door, again, for that particular fraud use case. In terms of the concept around frameworks and data strategies you asked about, Kevin, what is the best practice we've seen? I mean, the questions that we recommend organizations ask themselves is look at the data that you have and what data you need. When and where is that data needed? So make sure it's in the right place to be leveraged pre, post, or in flight of a transaction, and not all data is needed to be managed real-time in flight of a transaction. That's not realistic to even achieve in many cases. So it's about being prioritizing the data and putting it in the right place to use it at the right time. I think we've talked about data quality extensively enough, so I won't harp on too much about that, but that is probably the most pivotal linchpin in these capabilities actually being effective. And then data aggregation we've already talked about. So where have we seen examples of this? The NPP had a similar focus to the UK, where they focused on transaction history data standardization. So our version of ACH, which is called direct entry, had very minimal data points. And I think much like what the statistic you used before, Kevin, there are a lot of blank fields in that data. And that ended up being an exposure point for the financial institutions who are using those tags as mandatory fields within their fraud detection algorithms, right? The NPA is picking up, in the UK, is picking up a very similar story. They're heavily focused on data quality standards at an industry level. So that's not just transactional data, that's KYC data is their big focus at the moment, and they're looking to aggregate that as well. I think that probably covers off most of the framework.
So from an ROI perspective, there's some of the harder statistics around reducing crime, but you also have to balance that against the efficiency of your organization, the customer experience. You need to aggregate data. You have to have the right data at the right time. It kind of reminds me, we were, a few of us, Stephanie was there, I was there last week, Swift held a machine learning, artificial intelligence seminar, and we had some people from some pretty forward-looking firms and some big tech firms, and they said, we talked about the war for talent in one of the sessions yesterday, and one of the ways you attract data scientists in war for talent is to kind of have your act together as it relates to data. Because true data scientists want to go play with big data sets, was kind of the message that came away. But you also have to balance that, and Stephanie brought this out earlier, in terms of how do you make sure that that data isn't biased and you're using it in the right way. So it was a really interesting conversation. But we'll move towards, what do you expect from your counterparties, right? There's a lot of players in this space. There's a lot of information. As we look across the industry, what do you expect? And I may pick on Stephanie first for this one, and we'll let Lisa and Cyrus jump in after if
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll use an analogy here. In the world of cyber fraud, let me take a step back. When you're running away from a bear, what do they say? You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the person beside you. It's the same thing with cyber fraud, right? Because they move to the least, the organization of least resistance, or industry of least resistance as it relates to that. And so that's why, as we've talked about, putting up all of the appropriate protections across the payment life cycle, as well as the infrastructure, is important. But you can't do it alone either. So the fintechs, the corporations, the regulators, the financial market utilities, the messaging services, your clients, third parties, everybody is part of the ecosystem, and you can't do it alone, because as I had indicated before, we are an integrated, interconnected, whether we like it or not, community. And so it's really important to understand what those connections are, establish those relationships, have a governance and a plan, a guidebook. And I purposely use guidebook instead of playbook. And I know there's lots of industries and lots of companies saying, we need a cyber playbook. You don't need a cyber playbook. You need a cyber guidebook. You need to understand who you need in the room, who's going to make the decision, who is the decision maker. You don't need the step-by-step of, write this here, click this, that, et cetera, et cetera. You need to know how to go about it, for sure, no question. But from a strategic level, you need to know the very basics of governance, communication, strategy, levels of accountability, and people to go and execute against that guidebook. And you need that across, if your customer is having a cyber bad day, what do they need to know and do? And you need to assist them, and that's the preparedness part of making sure they know that in advance. When an incident is happening, what they need to do, how you need to do it, and you as an institution, how you're going to respond associated with that. Everybody knows their part to play. Everybody knows who the decision is. Everybody knows who needs to be communicated to, what needs to be communicated to, who's allowed to communicate externally, et cetera. And as well as where that money is destined. Do you have the networks already established, as well as those accountabilities and communication frameworks of who you're going to talk to on the other side, right? So GPI will tell you exactly where your payment is. Do you know how to talk to somebody at that bank in Bangladesh, in Taiwan, in the Congo, etc., and have established those networks because that's where the money is and that's where you're going to have to contact them. You also need to be well integrated with your information security team, who will also have those connections with law enforcement in all of those respective countries as best as possible, or they will know somebody of how to get there. So we are a small world, but we're not in many ways. And so there are, when somebody says you need lots of arms and legs, this isn't one octopus. This is like 7,000 octopuses and all those arms and legs of all of the things that you need to think about, have ready in place, and have thought about it and have tested to ensure that that interconnectedness, there's an understanding of how that works and how in a cyber event, whether it's cyber breach or cyber fraud, you can use that interconnectedness to get through the bad day and see tomorrow.
Thank you, and I'll probably pick on Lisa next, but so it takes a village. It takes a well-prepared and tested village to combat this. You touched on, collaborating and information sharing. And Lisa, perhaps you could maybe start us off with, what information should we be keeping to ourselves? What information do you think, or are there any frameworks or guidelines or thoughts you have around what can be shared? And from a regulatory perspective, there's obviously a lot to balance in terms of risks and privacy. So any thoughts you can share with us there?
Yeah, I think as financial institutions, there are legal constraints on what information can be shared and with who and for what purposes. We have common law obligations on confidentiality. We can't share personal information except in accordance with privacy laws. And there are also AML and ATF laws that you have to be mindful of against tipping if that could prejudice an investigation into money laundering. So we have to tread carefully when it comes to sharing information and keep these laws and these requirements top of mind. But ultimately, I think, as I alluded to before, it's cooperation and harmonization among the industry is essential in today's environment. And I think from a regulatory perspective, we're also looking to our regulators to level the payment field and impose standard or uniform requirements on all payment service providers to ensure there's a consistent approach to endpoint security, both domestically but also in line with what we're seeing internationally. So I think we do have to work together to protect the financial system as a whole, but we'll ultimately benefit from the learnings from each other and extending our reach beyond our borders to do that. Great,
thanks. And wearing my SWIFT hat, what I heard was standards, because standards is very important. So, especially as we start to move into the world of ISO 20022. So thank you for that. So we may start with Stephanie on this one. So I'll give you a little bit of a heads up. But what's next? Every day, you talked about getting through the bad day, right? Cyber attacks are more frequent. They're here to stay. They're increasingly sophisticated. You talked about a guidebook. So before and after events, you talked about talking with the right legal teams and the police in the jurisdiction. Anything else you want to talk about in terms of before and after from a cyber perspective?
Yeah, I mean, when you and I'm sure all of your organizations are working through and have implemented some form of a framework, and how I think about that framework is sort of a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional grid, depending upon the day, and you'll read in lots of material the baseline of people, process, and technology. And I would look at that layered approach also through the lens, to what Lisa opened us up with, breaking it down between protect, detect, incident management, incident recovery, both technology, and then lessons learned. And when you're looking at a cyber incident and you're looking through your framework and building out the guidebook, reacting to all of those different protect, detect, incident recovery across people, process, and technology, you need to think about not just the technology component, but the business implications associated with it. And for those of us on the payment side, the technology team, they will go off and address the technology components of it. As the business people and ownership around payments and the attributes and the product and the P&L associated with payments, we need to understand and be prepared and know the implications and be able to feed that information to the decision makers of what those business implications are. If you're down for 4 hours, you just missed cutoff, what does that mean to the bank's liquidity position, reserve position? What does that then translate into your customer's position? Are you the settlement agent for financial market utility? Are you a settlement agent for some of the other major banks, et cetera? So then you need to understand who you're going to impact, the extent to which they're going to impact, what's the repercussions on your own firm, the repercussions on the clients, and the repercussions on the industry. Because as we've seen in past history and through other crises, if you're down and a major player cannot settle the end of day, you're going to create systemic liquidity risk. And so you need to understand what that means and have strategies thoughtful in advance of how you're going to manage that and or communicate that, because within, and it depends upon the country, when you have a cyber incident, you have 2 hours or less to report that, and you may not have all of the necessary information, which is why you need to be planned much more in advance and think about the business implication aspect of it, because that is what's going to take you down as much as a technical outage is going to necessarily take you down.
So listening to Stephanie, I think there will
scare
certainly
you?
be a lot of drinks consumed tonight at the party. So final question, we have just under 10 minutes left in the panel, so hopefully you're all thinking about questions you might want to ask to the panel. And I think we've heard some advice and certainly a lot of considerations that you have to think about. But organizations have different risk tolerances, they have different resources, they have different priorities. Are there any suggestions you could make as they look across their own priorities? And I'll open it up to the entire panel, maybe starting with Lisa in terms of the organizations.
I'd start with continuing to invest internally in your employees in the prevention of cybercrime. I think that's fundamental, along with the other areas I talked a lot about in my intro. Externally, I'd get involved with the industry. In Canada, there is a group called JORM, which is the Joint Operational Resilience Management Program. And it's a group consisting of Canadian FMIs, the Department of Finance, Canadian banks, and the Canadian Bankers Association. And it's about working together. In their case, they get together to assess response strategies for unexpected situations like a cyber event. And doing that and working collaboratively, I think, is a consistent theme that we're hearing from everyone. And I think we have good precedent for that in Canada, and we'll continue to prioritize those efforts.
Thanks, Lisa.
I agree absolutely 100% with all of that. But I would also say that protection isn't going to protect you 100% of the time. You have to assume that somebody at some point in time is going to get through. You are going to get hacked, yourself or your customer, in one form or fashion. And as some of the corporate clients that had experienced NotPetya had indicated, they had thought about a bad day, and they thought about really bad days. They'd never thought about what kind of a bad day it really could be. So they thought about it's never going to happen to us. It is going to happen. And so you need to take that vein of, it is going to happen, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be fast, and you need to do that level of preparedness. So it's about advocating in your organizations the need for having a cyber risk or cyber fraud strategy that's thoughtful, that is inclusive across all functions, compliance, legal, operations, tech controls, et cetera, because it's that impactful to your organization. And while, again, you don't think it's going to necessarily take down all of, the Royal Bank or Bank of Montreal or CIBC, but what if it takes out the Caribbean branch? Then what? Or it takes out, et cetera. And we've seen, and there are cases, public cases, more so in the Far East, where those financial institutions that were having a bad day had to unplug themselves from the SWIFT network or from their respective FMI. So are you planned for that? Do you know what that means? And again, the business implications of liquidity, credit, and systemic risk associated with an action that you may think is drastic, but we've seen it more than once already. So.
Kind of reminds me of a children's book, and it was called Alexander and the No Good Terrible Day. Some days are like that, even in Australia. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if there are any questions in the audience, and we're happy to look to address them in the next few minutes, or we're also happy to stay behind and answer questions as we go. So. Yes, please. Can everyone hear Eric?
Will you repeat the question?
Interesting. We heard about the terrible day, the day that we don't want to happen, but might happen, and we should be prepared for it. We heard about what's appropriate to share and what's not appropriate to share for privacy and other concerns. And you talked about things like anonymized data sets. And I'm curious, and a candid answer, when it comes to the terrible day, and you're a financial institution, participate in the market, what's the responsibility? And how can you appropriately share your experience with other financial institutions, with market infrastructures in a way that's actually going to be constructive and help that next player avoid that terrible day?
So, did everyone hear the question? I think the question was around sharing of information and learning from that and passing that on, to the community in an appropriate way. And so one way, I'll have a crack at it and then I'll open it up to the panel, but I know if you're in the SWIFT community, for example, we have an ISAC, SWIFT ISAC. There is a financial services ISAC as well. And if you're subscribed to the SWIFT ISAC for no cost, we will push to you anonymized threats, indicators of compromise that you can then leverage. So, for example, it's no longer the $100 million transaction. It always tends to be on a, fraud always happens on a Friday afternoon type of thing. But as, Stephanie was talking about, it's increasingly sophisticated. It's increasingly layered. It's not the $1 billion transaction, right? It's not just the exotic currencies anymore. So that's some ways I think the industry are dealing with it, and I know that SWIFT is taking an active role in that, but I'll open it to the panel for other considerations.
Well, I mentioned the JORM group. There's also other working groups that are designed exactly to do that, to test each other's response strategies to particular situations. And then, from a legal perspective, I'm looking to regulators to start lessening some of the requirements that financial institutions have to abide by in exceptional circumstances where it really would be beneficial to the industry as a whole to be able to share more detail. So we're looking to regulators and asking for permission and the laws to change to support that because of the interconnectedness of the financial system as it stands, exactly for the point you're raising. And there are, at the same time, laws that are surfacing. So depending on the circumstances, we now have mandatory breach notification requirements under privacy law that came into effect last November. So the legal and regulatory landscape is changing to accommodate just that out of pure necessity and really to foster that collaboration that we need to have.
Yeah, I think there's probably two components to answer to your question. One is the forums, as Lisa mentioned. There's the SWIFT forums. I know there's a number that exist domestically within the US. I think the global ones are a little bit trickier to rationalize, especially when you're starting to talk about emerging markets and getting access to their data is not necessarily the problem. It's commingling that with data of a country that maybe we are a little bit we're a little bit more conscious of how we share that. All right, so there are practices and capabilities that allow for that, and then you've got to find a compromise between how much data you share versus the benefit of anonymizing it or redacting it to the point that it's no longer effective. The second part to that is less about the sharing of the stories and the sharing of raw data, but actually platform capability that allows you access to this data in such a way that it prevents future fraudulent experiences. So the fraudulent experiences we can discuss in the forums, but there's no point discussing them if you can't really do much about them without certain external capability, whether that be data or a new functionality or a new system or tool. And in many cases, it's very rarely the system or the tool. We were talking, Stephanie and I, about a completely different topic earlier. It's not the technology normally that drives some of these challenges. That's always able to be sorted out in many cases. It's an operating model around that protects their data. And so we've seen companies like EWS, even SimCorp here in Canada to an extent, Equifax, Quandl, there are a host of them that are platforms for financial and non-financial data. And that is probably where I think the next lever is, to have global access to that kind of data and to work out how to best feed that into our detection algorithms, and then take that to the next level by saying, okay, rather than being a static algorithm, how do we expand that to, say, a machine learning or an artificial intelligence style algorithm, or at least an education model?
Yeah,
Any- sorry, any-
sorry. No, I was just going to add that, if you go to, federal information sharing forums with the UK, the Federal Reserve, the US, et cetera, they all have guidebooks, best practices documents. Those are informed from incidences, from lessons learned, et cetera. Those aren't built out of, somebody sitting in a box somewhere. They are well informed around good things that people should be doing because they've seen what people weren't doing and how they got caught. So there, and even financial institutions, I mean, every bank probably has a cyber advisory toolkit. Those are more likely well informed with regards to what you should and shouldn't be doing across any of the types of payments or your infrastructure.
So we've gone a little past time. We're happy to stay on afterwards, answer questions and things like that. And I'm sure the panelists will be around later on, and some of my best conversations with Cyrus have been over a glass of something. And so we're definitely happy to continue the dialogue, but I need to release you all. So please give a round of thanks to my panel.